Good afternoon in Africa and good morning in the United States, and welcome to our monthly Africa-US Forum, the year ahead for the African continent. This forum is on the record and is being recorded. Video will be available on demand later on the USC Africa-US website. You can also find videos there of all of our forums. Our next forum will be on Monday, February 24th at this same time. Once again, we'll have speakers from across Africa, live streamed worldwide, with participants in person in Washington, D.C. We have a number of speakers from across the continent with us today, beginning with remarks by a distinguished representative of the African Union. Each will be introduced in turn, and those of you who are with us in person, a block from the White House in Washington, D.C., have their biographies in writing. For those of you joining online, we will post links to their biographies in chat as each person speaks. These monthly forums are presented by, in alphabetical order, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and you'll be hearing from Bob Wekesa shortly. The Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy at the University of Southern California, and Judy Kang and I represent the USC. The Center for African Studies at Howard University, the Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. We begin, as always, with our co-convener, Bob Wekesa, USC Annenberg's inaugural Africa Fellow and Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in Johannesburg. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much, colleagues, the speakers, as well as the participants for making time for today's event. I believe Adam has described our Africa-US Forum initiative quite well. Many of the speakers and attendants to this event will be aware that we've been running this program since the December of 2022 rather. And so it's been around for quite a while. And on today's event, we thought, being January as it is, we will start off by looking at what is likely to happen on the continent. In other words, expectations from the continent across the various issues: developmental, peace and security, trade and economics, climate change, that are going to happen across the continent, as well as political developments from one country to the other, but also broadly from the African continent in a more comprehensive sense. We have a good cast of speakers, and rather than go on to introduce each one at the same time at this introductory stage, I want to suggest that I can introduce the speakers at the point when they are speaking. In any case, we have the bios of the speakers on our website links, which will be provided, or you might have interacted with. And I cannot help it but mention that on the peace and security front, we have a major problem on the continent happening as we speak, because I think the M23 rebels or fighters in Eastern DRC have actually almost on the verge of taking over Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. I think last week we saw that the governor of North Kivu was killed. The UN has weighed in, and the regional partners. I just saw today that Kenyan President William Ruto is convening a meeting of the East African community to discuss this very serious development in the Eastern DRC, which neighbors Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda and South Sudan and Central African Republic, one of the largest countries on the continent. And at the same time, just slightly up north, we have the Sudan, where initial indications were that about 23,000 people had died. This has been revised only last week to indicate that there are 60,000 people dead, and this might be just conservative figures. So we are looking at potentially a failed state there, failed state on the same level as Somalia. And of course, we have recent elections in places such as Mozambique, Ghana, Botswana, and Namibia. We are very glad to have Professor Adriano Nuvunga from Mozambique, where the elections have not gone as smoothly as people have expected. But, I'm weighing in too much, yet we have a very good panel here. So rather than, go on and on about the challenges and perhaps the opportunities, I'd like at this point in time to invite Mr. Mustafa Sakr. He is the Principal Trade Officer leading the Trade and Markets Unit at the African Union Development Agency, better known as NEPAD, at least in the past, to kick us off. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, my brother Bob, for the quick introduction, and very good morning to all esteemed participants, and or good afternoon, depends on where you are. It is my pleasure to deliver an opening remarks on behalf of Her Excellency Madam Nardos Bekele Thomas, CEO of the African Union Development Agency, AUDA-NEPAD, who unfortunately couldn't attend due to unforeseen circumstances. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, I would like, on behalf of AUDA-NEPAD, to extend our deepest gratitude to the USC Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership and Policy for its generous invitation for AUDA-NEPAD to be part of this important forum, reflecting on the future of trade, investment, and development in Africa. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, as we set the tone of our discussion today, it's crucial to remember that Africa is a continent abundant in resources, talent, and opportunities. Yet, we find ourselves at a crossroads in our journey toward realizing its full potential. Equally significant, this year's forum arrives at a pivotal moment as the international landscape, particularly in Africa, faces unprecedented challenges. However, 2025 also brings us with its new opportunities and hope. Our mission is therefore clear: to harness our unique strengths and collaborate to overcome the obstacles that have long embedded our progress as Africa. These efforts will be guided by the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, which was adopted during the AU summit in last February, targeting the following by 2033. First and foremost, to increase the intra-African trade from its current level, around 18% to 30% of Africa's total trade. Second target of the Agenda 2063 is sustained growth in manufacturing value added that surpasses GDP growth. Equally important is the target for increasing the share of high technology products in Africa's manufactured exports by 20%. Last but not least is to boost Africa's share of global manufacturing value added to up to 10%. From its current level, which is less than 2%. Distinguished participants, empirical evidence suggests that the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, commonly known as ACFTA, can be overemphasized as a game changer to propel development and prosperity across Africa, along with improving its resilience against future crises and shocks, as stipulated by both Agenda 2063 and UN Agenda 2030. In this respect, ACFTA can potentially reshape Africa's future by prompting export-oriented growth, creating jobs, particularly for women and youth, and accelerating structural transformation and economic integration agendas. For instance, UNCTAD expects around 33% increase in intra-African trade due to the successful implementation of the ACFTA. Moreover, of critical importance is to highlight that the ACFTA spurred potential opportunities are expected to be more substantial should we consider the multi-pronged relation with other flagship projects at both regional and continental level, like, for example, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, commonly known as PIDA program. As such, the World Bank alludes that the ACFTA's successful implementation can rise Africa's GDP by around by 9% and lift around 50 million African people out of the extreme poverty cycle by 2035. Unlocking these opportunities, Africa has demonstrated increasing unequivocal commitment, prompted by the soaring number of state parties from 27 in May 2019 to 48 member states signatories in the ACFTA by November 2024. This also has been supported by plenty of commitments from member states to put into effect this agreement. For example, for around 40 member states have put in place or have developed their own ACFTA implementation strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the remarkable success, the full realization of Africa's integration agenda, both regionally and continentally, is faced with several significant challenges, of which I would like to highlight the following. First of all is the prevailing raw material-based production structures, coupled with low productivity and competitiveness, which have long been a barrier to progress. For instance, Africa contributes less than 2% of global manufacturing, positioning us at the lower end of global value chain. Also, one of the key challenges are the obstacles that have been compounded by the lack of quality infrastructure to support trade and investment across Africa. Equally urgent is the insufficient development of human capital, which is crucial for African countries to compete effectively in the global economy. Moreover, Africa is grappling with an alarming annual financial gap estimated at around $300 billion annually, which represents around 7% of Africa GDP and around 34% of total investments. This brings us to the heart of our discussion today. What bold actions must be taken at all levels, regionally, continentally, and internationally, to unlock the full potential of trade and investment as a catalyst for sustainable, inclusive development process in Africa? In this regard, AUDA-NEPAD, as the development agency of the African Union, envisages a continent where inter-Africa trade has significantly increased, creating jobs, unlocking new opportunities for our people, strengthening our economies, and positioning Africa as a global trade hub. To achieve this, AUDA-NEPAD advocates focusing on 4 critical areas of intervention that are essential for supporting Africa's economic integration and realizing its aspiration. First and foremost is the human capital empowerment. Through the Energize Africa initiative, AUDA-NEPAD goes beyond the mere technology transfer to empower African youth with skills essential for competing in today's economy. Second key area is cross-border value chains development. AUDA-NEPAD support medium and small enterprises through various initiatives like, for instance, the Homegrown Solutions and also Africa Kaizen initiatives, which are currently active in over 30 countries across the continent. The third pillar for expediting trade and investment opportunities across Africa is the economic transformation. We, as AUDA-NEPAD, we focus on growing core industries such as agro-processing, pharmaceutical industries, green sectors, and minerals, while advocating and advancing emerging areas like blue economy and ICT driven industries across Africa. Last but not least is the quality infrastructure development. AUDA-NEPAD's integrated corridor approach strengthens hard and soft infrastructure development, including, among others, standards, information system, and energy, supporting Africa's transformation and enabling cross-border trade. Esteemed participants, in conclusion, I would like to allude that AUDA-NEPAD is confident that our productive and insightful deliberations today will pave the way forward for a promising and prosperous future for all African people. Together, we can continue to make significant strides in realizing our collective goals and look forward to the promising future ahead. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think it sets us off to a starting point. I'm certain there will be a couple of our attendants, participants who would like to ask Mr. Sakr some questions. And I think I say this with the understanding that only last week, a day like this, we had a new president in the United States of America who has come with new policies that might impact African Continental Free Trade Area, for example. But that's not to say that there are no other partners that we need to think through in terms of their impact on intra-Africa trade and related matters. And so we have the chat box. Feel free to post questions in that chat box so that Mr. Mustafa and others will be able to respond to them. At this point, I would like to move on to Dr. Joana Dodoo, who is the lecturer with the Department of Business Programs at the College of Distance Education at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Dr. Dodoo is a regular, is our partner. Is spoken to in a number of our virtual events. But over to you, Dr. Dodoo, to launch into this discussion, looking at Africa in 2025. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bob, for the introduction. And I would like to appreciate the organizers of this important forum, which affords us the chance and opportunity to understand issues that are ongoing and how Africa can be positioned strongly to be a participant and a player in the economic, socio-economic development of the world. As rightly indicated, we are looking at expectations, what we expect. And before we look into what we expect, I would like us to draw our attention to what is pertaining at the moment. What is the situation at the moment? And one of the key issues, which I believe it's not only in Africa, but worldwide, is unemployment, the rising cases of unemployment. And we know that Africa's population, especially when it comes to the youth, is high. And we have a majority of this youthful population unemployed. This raises so much concern. And a number of these youth have resorted to survive by all means through various venturing into various activities. And most of them are not regulated. They are not backed by law and have so many implications. One of them that I would like to bring to fore is a research that I conducted on this youth unemployment and the quest to survive by all means. I know that the introduction of the use of tricycles and motorcycles for commercial transportation is common in West Africa and some parts of East Africa. I think in East Africa, it is known as Boda Boda. In Nigeria, they refer to it as Okada. And in Ghana, it has come to Ghana. This, it's one of the ways that youth are trying to use to survive, to use it as a form of employment. And my research was focused on finding out why the youth are jumping into this business. And the simple reason is we need to survive. In Ghana, although in other African countries, it appears normal, but in Ghana, to use the tricycles and the motorcycle for commercial business, for commercial fare-paying transportation, is illegal. It is not supported by the Road Traffic Regulations 2012, LI 2180. it prohibits the use of power two to three-wheeler to offer fare-paying passenger services, except for courier and delivery purposes. But because the youth want to survive by all means, now it has flipped. It is being used for commercial fare-paying transport services. Others feel that it is convenient because they are able to use roads that are not really meant to be roads. And so it is in use. But the question here is, what is the regulation saying? What is the law enforcer saying? They appear helpless. So as we are looking at expectations, one key point I would like us to consider is employment for the youth. It's law enforcement. And with law enforcement, they will be able to provide the enabling environment that will support youth initiatives that is good for them and their quality of life. In my research, I came across the findings for instance, that cycle itself, it is not conducive enough for their safety and health. And that dovetails into the International Labour Organization's quest for safe work. So I asked myself, how safe is this work? And we can find a number of youth involved in this venture that is not safe for them and their health. This has implication on our already volatile healthcare system. How are we putting in place? So we expect improvement in our healthcare system to cater for some of the issues that are emerging. The tricycles themselves, as I mentioned, they are not safe by design because they are not made for this prolonged use. And it has occupational safety and health implications because these riders who are mostly youthful are exposed to a number of hazards, mostly the physical and economic hazards. Physically, because of the prolonged use of these tricycles, they face the harsh conditions of the weather. In most areas in Africa and Ghana in particular, it is tropical. So the sun is so hot. So these people will be on the sun for the best part of the day, seeking for customers, seeking to survive, working to earn some income to support themselves and their household, exposed to the harsh conditions, no regulations to even support their well-being. In terms of ergonomic, this tricycle, they sit on it for a long time, prolonged period of time, vibration, heat, the noise coming from the motorcycles. These are all health issues. And I think it's important as we are looking at expectations, it's important we think about all these because it has health implications for the future. Today, we may not really pay attention to them because we may not see it as a pressing issue, but in the long term, we would want our youth to be in a good health condition, health state, to benefit from every interventions that is being put in place. Another area that I would like us to pay attention to is the issue of still trickling down from the unemployment to the issue of illegal mining. And this, I think, pertains to Ghana. Due to unemployment, a number of youth have also moved into the mining, illegal mining, and doing it with abandon, destroying water bodies, entering into forest reserves. And there's so many health issues that are associated with it. So currently, in the discourse that is ongoing, a number of the forest cover has been exploited. And it has implication on our cocoa producing sector. and which also has implication on our international trade. So if care is not taken, if proper interventions are not put in place, a time will come, it will be a big problem. And so in looking at what to do, what bold actions to do, I think that enforcement, I want to propose that enforcement of regulations should be key. State actors, political actors, state institutions must be emboldened enough to enforce the regulations. 2, education. Dr. Mustafa talked about education. Yes, it's very important. We need to educate our youth. Most of these our youth who are involved in this motorcycle business, a number of them are unskilled with low-level education. And so they just jump on this motorcycle and they start doing those business without recourse to road safety regulations, putting their lives in danger, the lives of their customers and the lives of other road users in danger. So education is another bold action that we expect state actors to really pay attention to. The next bold action is the fact that we need to make these tricycles safe by design, by installing some safety design. There should be installed some safety measures into the cycle, which will protect them, which will protect the users, so that as it has become part of us, people will use the motorcycles to work to make a living, and their health and safety will be ensured. So in sum, I would like to point out these few bold actions and then the pertaining issues of unemployment, which is endemical, which needs to be addressed. And so I will end here for the rest of my other speakers to also speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dodoo. I think you've done a good job in projecting the challenges for the continent from the perspective of youth, touching on employment, touching on education, and touching on mining, the mining sector specifically. I think you have also alluded to what needs to be done in those domains. I was actually very surprised only last week to learn that we used to say the continent was 1 billion people a couple of years ago. Then we went to 1.2. And checking the figures last week, we're actually at 1.5 billion people. So officially, the continent is the most populated in the world. So these issues that you touch on are very important. And I'm certain that colleagues listening to it, to your perspectives, have comments, have questions, and we'll get to those as we go along. Allow me at this point in time to include, to invite our friend and colleague, Mr. Paul Nantulya, who is a research associate with the African Center for Strategic Studies out of DC. Over to you, Paul, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Good morning, good evening to colleagues wherever they are in the world. It's an important meeting. I think 2025 is going to be a consequential year for Africa, both in terms of I guess opportunities, but then challenges. But at the same time, a continent like this, with its demographic makeup and its future prospects, cannot be ignored. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people in the world will be African. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. These are statistics that have been shared by UNCTAD, the World Bank, and other credible institutions.
So it's an important continent. Over 80% of its population is between the ages of 15 and 30, meaning that the African continent is essentially, it's a continent of young people, and it's a continent of adolescents. And there are certain things that young people and adolescents are associated with. One is dynamism. Two is a demand, and it's solid, the demand for democracy and better standards of governance. That energy is coming from this particular cohort. You also have young African professionals that are mobile, that are engaging in, across borders through social media and other forms of communication. There's a lot of creativity on the continent. If you look at the record of startups in countries like Kenya, countries like Namibia, countries like Tanzania, countries like Ghana, this is a continent that cannot be ignored. So I would like to open my remarks by just reminding the wider public out there of important data points that suggest that this is a continent that needs to be taken seriously. I would like to focus on 4 points in terms of what 2025, what we're likely to see in 2025. I think on the diplomatic front, African countries are going to be maneuvering and exercising greater agency and stewardship in crafting and recalibrating the continent's engagement with external powers. At the beginning of the year, we saw the visit of the Chinese incumbent Chinese foreign minister to 4 African countries. This is a tradition that dates back to 1991. And this visit came on the heels of the 9th Forum for China-Africa Cooperation Summit, FOCAC, which took place in September. I was in Beijing at the time to talk to African delegates, governments, diplomats, and so on. And it is clear that, from the outcome of this visit, of Wang Yi's visit, that there are a number of things that African countries are prioritizing and putting on the table. And African countries are going to be having similar conversations, for instance, with the United States, with the European Union, with Japan. There's a Japan-Africa summit in Yokohama in August of this year, and other powers. The first is market access. And I think Dr. Mustafa, our colleague from the African Union, laid this out very clearly in his remarks early on. Market access is going to be hugely important for African countries. And the discussions that took place in Beijing at the 9th FOCAC summit, market access was really one of the major items on the agenda. So increased market access. There's some uncertainty in terms of where the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is going. There are lots of African delegates that are engaging the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress in particular to look at AGOA, because AGOA has come up for renewal, and to see what that might bring, and that touches directly on the issue of market access. The other is balanced trade, and I think there were some lots of comments that different African leaders have made with regard to the issue of balanced trade. Because while, for instance, China is the continent's largest trade partner and is also the largest trade partner of the majority of African countries, the nature of that trade is still very lopsided, in the sense that the continent is mostly exporting unprocessed or semi-processed raw material and importing manufactured goods, finished products from China, But again, this is it's not unique to the Africa-China relationship, because this is the nature of the relationship that African countries have with other major powers, and there are voices that are pointing out the flaws and the dangers of a structure of trade that creates massive trade deficits between Africa and its selected international partners. So the issue of balanced trade, which is directly related to the question of market access, will be key in 2025. And we've heard statements coming out of, for instance, Zambia, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Senegal. So I think this is something that's going to be front and center in 2025 and beyond. The other is value addition, moving up the value chain. Again, going back to what Dr. Mustafa was talking about earlier. But I tend to think that the initiative for that, at the end of the day, will have to come from African countries in terms of policy frameworks that touch on how African countries can move up the value chain, right? So I think these three will be critically important going forward. With regard to the changing nature of the international system, we are seeing an uptick of global rivalry, and this is something that is intensifying, and it impacts Africa directly in the sense that even during the Cold War, when global rivalries were at their peak, African countries seemed to develop a diplomatic DNA of wanting to engage all sides without necessarily being pulled into competing blocs. We hear a similar language now coming out of many African capitals. We see it, for instance, in relation to the non-aligned movement, right? The whole idea that the continent should not be a battleground of competing interest. I think this discussion will be quite pronounced in 2025 and beyond. And looking at it from the perspective of China, it would be interesting to see how it plays out, because I want to paraphrase Kesho Mabubani, the great Singaporean academic and diplomat, who looks at the kind of way, the sorts of ways in which China has positioned itself on the continent and in other parts of the global south, and describes it as a preemptive strike. And what does he mean by this? And this is so when you look at, for instance, the trade that I was talking about, when you look at the Belt and Road program, when you look at the fact that China appears to have become a lender of last resort for many African countries, when one looks at the statistics and the data, for instance, in terms of human resource development, China, since 2011, 2012, has been training more African students and more African professionals than any other industrialized country, with the exception of France, for instance. In the infrastructure space, 1 out of every 3 major infrastructure projects is being constructed by Chinese conglomerates, and 1 out of every 5 is funded by Chinese policy banks. When you look at this web of relations, one then gets the perspective that it would be very difficult in the context of geopolitical tension and competition. It would be very difficult to get African countries to become part of a project of isolating China and so on, right? Which is what Kesho Mabubani describes as, China has conducted its economic relations in a way that it has launched a preemptive strike, in the sense that countries are essentially incentivized to become part of a process of containing China. So I think African countries will have many decisions to make. in this climate. There are changes. I mean, we're talking about changes in the United States, but there are changes that we're going to see from this year in China, for instance. I mean, next year, the Chinese Communist Party goes into its 5-yearly conference that selects the top leadership of the country, and obviously that also has an impact on China's foreign policy. So I think that would be the third element. I think we're going to see African countries maneuvering and positioning themselves to recalibrate their international partnerships. The final point that I would like to make is on the normative front. And I think there's going to continue the contestation of norms on the African continent. A major one is unconstitutional changes of government. What happens to the juntas, the governments that were overthrown by soldiers in the Sahel, on the west coast of Africa, and other places like Sudan and so on? I think this is a discussion that is likely to continue in 2025 in terms of how Africa enforces norms of conduct, in terms of how Africa reacts to such changes. The situation that is taking place right now as we speak in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, again, also touches on this in a very direct way. The question of empowerment of the African Union. The African Union adopted a reform program under the stewardship of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, and I think there's a lot of expectations that the African Union will become essentially more effective in delivering its mandate, in supporting development on the continent, peace and security, and so on. And I think this discussion will continue. Because there's no organization like the African Union, right? An empowered, a strong, and effective AU will be essential in solving many of these problems that we're talking about. So I think for me, these are the 4 strategic elements I wanted to talk about. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me, Bob. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And I would look forward to the interactive part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I just wanted to mention to the audience that Paul does a lot of work on Africa-China relations, and he publishes quite a lot. I would say he's one of the leading authorities on Africa-China relations. He did a very interesting piece that is on the Africa Center for Strategic Studies that was published early this month, early January, which casts forward expectations based on a review of the activities last year and where we are going in 2025. I'll urge that you have a look at that. Now, this year, the continent is going to go through no less than 10 elections. In fact, maybe when I say 10, I am underestimating. Some of the key elections are going to happen in Tanzania, in Gabon, in Central African Republic, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, name them. Last year, we had an election that has been very difficult to conclude properly, but this is the election in Mozambique. We have here Professor Adriano Nuvunga, who is director for the Center for Human Rights and Development. It has a proper name in Portuguese. So, Professor Nuvunga, I hope I'm not massacring the name. But I wanted to invite you to speak to not only that elections, but what you see in terms of matters, democracy, human rights from the perspective of elections, and of course, any other perspectives for the continent this year. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for the opportunity to be here to share some perspectives from Mozambique and I also salute my co-panelists and our audience. Well, indeed, Mozambique is Mozambique's democracy was inaugurated some 3 decades ago. And what we saw last year, it was unprecedented. And I'll be sharing some insights on that. But my first point is that the recent political and the human rights crisis in Mozambique serve very well as a deconstruct of the concept of dominant political parties in our region. As you know, this region is governed by dominant parties. Dominant party in Mozambique, Frelimo, dominant party in South Africa, ANC, dominant party in Tanzania, CCM, dominant party in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF, dominant party in Angola, the MPLA, dominant party in Botswana. They lost the election, but a dominant party in SWAPO in Namibia. And there's been a lot of discussion in terms of relationship between dominant parties and democracies. And many people have been labeling Frelimo as a dominant party. In my publications, I have tried to unpack that and say, Frelimo is not properly a dominant party in the sense that it is not genuinely voted by the people, but it is because they control the machinery of the state. Remember, Frelimo, just like the ZANU-PF, just like the MPLA, they come from a tradition of former liberation movements that have turned into governments. And in the case of Frelimo, and also in the case of the MPLA, after 10 years of liberation struggle, starting in 65 to 75, they then experienced a civil war. And both parties, they survived the civil wars to reemerge and dominate the 3 decades of democracies in Mozambique and Angola. But in the case of Mozambique, in the 3 decades of democracy, there have been intervals with peace and return to a low-intensity civil war. In fact, Mozambique needed, following the 1994 peace agreement, it needed 2 more peace agreements to be where it is today, with a relatively stable, but with several shocks. So Mozambique experienced that, but what we saw last year, it was unprecedented. Unprecedented in that, not unlike in the past, that the post-election violence, it was waged by a former rebel movement. But last year, it was urban-based, youth-based protests, violent protests against the establishment, against the Frelimo state, because there is no distinction between Frelimo, the former liberation movement, and the state. So Mozambique, the state hasn't been properly emancipated from Frelimo. So Mozambique's democratization process gave an opportunity for Mozambique, for Frelimo to regain power instead of emancipating the state from the former one-party state rule. 500 people were killed, properties destroyed, and it was severe, the violence. But how did we as a nation arrive to that point? What happened for the country to be there? Be there in terms of having protests, violent protests, challenging what is perceived to be a dominant party. How can that be? Remember, 10 years ago, Christine Lagarde, the then IMF director, she was in Mozambique to convene what was the Africa Rising Conference. And at that conference, she said Mozambique would be the next Qatar of Africa. And the statistics were standing with Mozambique, projecting Mozambique to become a lower middle income country in the next 10 years. So 2024, it would be the 10-year time for Mozambique to become a lower middle income country with opportunities for everybody. In fact, Mozambique had everything: massive aid, massive investments at the energy sector. At that time, it had peace and stability and young people. So it had everything, water, everything to become a lower middle income country and to become the beacon of post-war democracy, development, and hopefully inclusive prosperity. But Christine Lagarde did not know that on that date, or that date of the conference, the country had undergone what was later discovered to be a 2 billion tuna bond corruption scandal. And that big corruption scandal, $2 billion, which is 10% of Mozambique's GDP at the time, it was what is in the literature is framed as borrowing against the future revenues in the extractive sector. The then outgoing government, they decided to eat part of the future, and they have gone out to borrow illegally $2 billion, which was arguably for investment, but was never invested. As a result, when it was discovered, donors cut aid and the country sank in debt distress, the cost of investment in Mozambique. So the measures, the totals, the measures in oil and gas industry that are investing in Mozambique, all of a sudden, they saw the cost of investment skyrocketing, turning Mozambique into what in the literature is framed as a resource scarce. So Mozambique, because it has not yet started the production of its world-class gas reserves, so it cannot be framed as a resource scarce. In fact, it's a resource scarce. So it's a scarce even before production started. And and last year, instead of being framed as that lower middle income country, Mozambique is by the United Nations framed as the 5th most impoverished country in the world. So you may imagine a decade that was for Mozambique to become a lower middle income country because of corruption and bad governance. Mozambique became the most impoverished country in a context where it experienced an exponential growth of the population. When we became, we ended the civil war, the moment that we started the democracy journey, we were 20 million people. Now, 3 decades later, Mozambique is 33 million people, of which the young people are almost 40%. So these young people, they have nothing because of greed, because of corruption and poor leadership. Parallel to this, Mozambique is experiencing the violent extremism in the north. which, because again of elite-centric extractivism, it is exacerbated to the point that it remains faceless. Almost 7 years after the beginning, it remains faceless, and it has further reduced or weakened Mozambique's statelessness, the level of the state, which was already poor, one of the poorest in our region. It is now eroded further to the extreme that Mozambique has to borrow troops from Rwanda to help repeal violent extremism. But it is not succeeding because the root causes of that problem are embedded in poor governance and grand corruption. And as I move to conclude, Mozambique is affected by what is happening in most dominant parties, democracies, where dominant parties, they think that democracy is what happens within its structures. So has nothing to do with society. To the extreme that with such a crisis, people protesting, they decided simply to repeal the population, to cut internet, to target people, killing 500 people, injuring thousands, arresting thousands, turning what was a political crisis into a human rights outcry and crisis. And the African Union, SADC, they have failed to help Mozambique to steer a path of reconciliation, a path of that would lead to stability. They seemed to be more interested in Mozambique's economic corridors. So they are sending troops to protect that, neglecting that economics, it has always to be a dividend of peace and stability. Investing to protect the corridors will not pay because the root causes of the crisis, they are still there. So SADC and the African Union supported the Frelimo to go on to inaugurate an illegitimate president, which has turned Mozambique into an ungovernable society. As I'm speaking here, there are 7 protests happening. People, they're not accepting to pay toll gates, not accepting to pay the bills of water, not accepting to pay anything because they call the president non-legitimate. So what we see in Mozambique is neglect of the young people, marginalization of the young people, but more importantly is a country with such a massive potential that is being denied shared prosperity because of corruption, bad governance, and poor leadership. So to conclude is to say that the World Bank said early in the 90s that governance matters. That framing could not be so fresh, so new, as we see countries with massive potential. I mean, now you see Maputo is like Haiti. Everything is burning simply because governance is not right and the regional forces are failing to hold Mozambique accountable to set governance right in order to avoid that its collapse as a nation affect the overall stability of the region and of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nuvunga. I think your presentation has been very, very clear. You've analyzed. For me, what really struck was the comparison of, do we start with economic development first and then democracy, human rights, and good governance will follow? Or do we start with good governance, democracy, human rights, and then economic development will follow? It is quite something when you look at these two positions. And I'm certain we'll get to discuss these perspectives. Plus, it's quite important that we have had you to speak to a problem that is unfolding before our own eyes. South Africa, where we are based, is just next door. And of course, you pointed out the inaction or lack of proper focus by the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the AU, and so forth. I'm certain we'll have an opportunity to discuss and unpack those when we come back to you to respond to audience questions. At this point, I would like to invite my colleague and friend, Mikatekiso Kubayi, is a researcher, senior researcher from the Institute for Global Dialogue, which is associated with the University of South Africa, UNISA, in Pretoria. He works on the G20, and South Africa is hosting the G20 later this year. So over to you, Mikatekiso.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wekesa, for a very generous introduction. Apologies for having arrived, at this hour, having missed, several presentations. I am at a conference also discussing development issues, development finance, particularly for Africa's development and so on. I'm in Zambia as we speak. I had to rush to my hotel room just to join this meeting. Thank you so much. I mean, quite often we talk about, well, at least pivoting from Dr. Nuvunga's last presentation, at least what I was able to gather. We quite often talk about, the need for Africa to, represent, to put its best foot forward, if you like, and exercise agency, exercise responsiveness, to the challenges faced by African populations. Example, we at a conference right now looking at, how to best fund, or best source financing for Africa's development, whether it be it infrastructure, whether it be it investment for, industry and so on. And what often, what we often come across, are questions about what is Africa itself, willing to do, to what extent, is, African agents, willing and able to move, on particular, issues in order to get to advance progress, on acquisition of finance and so on. The reality is, we're in, a tight, spot, if I may. We're in a very tight spot, not just, as Africa, the continent, but, we're in a very tight spot as the global South. We're in a very tight spot because on the one hand, you need, to access, you are in desperate need or in urgent need, of development, right? You are, generations sometimes, in some examples, behind the developed, economies when it comes to standards of living, etc. And those standards, right, also, help to sustain a particular culture, within societies, the culture that you're talking about, on good governance, and so on and so forth. we're in some cases we're very far behind, and we need to catch up in that regard. Now, what we tend to find on our continent is that as much as you have certain pockets of examples of attempts at a decent amount of agency, either on the part of the African Union, or on the part of individual member states, we unfortunately unable to move, or either we lacking the material or the resources, or what have you, to move fast enough or flexibly enough to try to attempt to close some of these gaps. And it's so palpable. You can hear or feel the tension that some commentators when we attend some of these conferences like the one that I'm in now, the worry or the anxiety, if you like, but you can almost touch it, when talking about what has to be done by Africa and for Africa, in this regard. It's a mighty difficult and tight spot that we're in. We're talking about commentators are talking about the need to expedite capacity building, for example, right? Now there's two issues. You've got domestic capacity building by domestic capacity builders, right? Versus capacity building by external capacity builders. And there are certain tensions around that, and the financing associated with such capacity building, and to what extent all of this can best be reconciled. And the reality is, as much as we may want to be building all of this capacity for Africa, we have to do all of this, in an environment that right now, unfortunately, can't be that friendly. It can't be that friendly because, we talk about geopolitical, what is it? What they call it? Geopolitical fragmentation. According to economists at the South African Reserve Bank, geopolitical fragmentation, meaning by geopolitical tensions, and crisis, pretty much everywhere. You're talking about circumstances, that according to the IMF, find money is now globally shifting from pure what is it, benevolence, and just solidarity in assisting development of regions to areas that are more politically aligned, right? So this is a reality that we're actually facing today. It is very mighty difficult to get done what we need to get done for Africa, and so we don't have a lot of time for this to achieve this thing that we want to achieve. On the apologies for this, I keep getting disrupted. We do not have a lot of time on our hands, and a lot of action needs to be taken. A lot of decisiveness needs to happen, and unfortunately we're up against it, in my view. And I would argue, as much as some of us as scholars, researchers, academics, we will talk about the need for this agency, the need for action, the need for responsiveness, the need for predictability, the need for anticipatory governance, the need for all of these things that we say Africa ought to have to achieve this African Renaissance. But the reality is that right now the environment, the global environment, is actually mighty difficult. And all the more what is it, the need for agency, the agency for agency, if you like, that we need right now to get things done. Yeah, I think I will halt it there for the time being. Once again, I'm absolutely sorry to have arrived at a late hour, having missed quite a bit. I'm willing to respond to questions and remarks and so on afterwards.
Thank you, Mikatekiso, and thanks for making time under a very tight schedule out there in Lusaka, Zambia. I wanted to, we can now, I believe, transition to responses from the audience plus my own interventions as moderator. We have about 20 minutes to do this. I know that there's an audience out there in person in DC, and I think we'll wait to see how that can happen. There's my colleagues in DC can also advise who wants to speak physically. And as I do that, I want to recognize Professor Ahmed Legroy from Morocco. He has actually put in the chat a question about, or a comment relating to success stories. I know that we've been on and on about the negativities. Professor Adriano Nuvunga, of course, did mention the whole concept of Africa Rising, which was a great narrative about 15 years ago. And some people believe Africa is still rising, but at the same time, we see very many challenges. So I think we've agreed with Professor Ahmed Legroy that in a future event, we'll want to focus also on areas of advancement. But so that we are focused on the questions that have arisen, particularly from the speakers, to Dr. Sakr Mustafa from AUDA, Africa Union Development Agency. A question here is, how does the AUDA-NEPAD align its projects with the broader African Union or African Union Agenda 2063? I think we seem to be forgetting about our long-term plan called Agenda 2063. You can help us unpack that. And how could you share more about the programs that AUDA-NEPAD is undertaking? Because I think NEPAD, New Partnerships for African Development, is the continental think tank. So maybe you can respond to that, Dr. Sakr. If you're still there.
Yes, Dr. Wekesa, thank you very much for this question. Once again, it's my pleasure to be part of this discussion. Broadly speaking, I can say that the main starting point for our activities as AUDA-NEPAD is the Agenda 2063, and to be more precise, as our audience may aware, the African Union has agreed to design a 10-year implementation plan to put into effect the aspirations and the target agreed upon in Agenda 2063 into implementation. So in 2023, in 2013, the first 10-year implementation plan was drafted. And as I mentioned, by last year, we launched the second 10-year implementation plan. So as a starting point, we align all our thematic areas of intervention to align with the priorities mentioned in this implementation plan, simply because on an annual basis and on a regular basis, and whenever we receive an information request from member states, we need to report back against the goals and targets set in this agreement. In brief, it was agreed that the second 10-year implementation plan will prioritize 7 key priorities or aspirations called Moonshot. They cover all the areas of development for Africa, starting from the political scene to silence all the guns and the wars across Africa, till we reach good governance and good political development across the continent. As I mentioned in the beginning of my intervention, we already, when it comes to trade and investment, we are confined with specific targets approved by member states. like, for example, to increase the inter-African trade by from its level, which is estimated around 18 to 30%. And that one, and the same applies across the various thematic areas. In fact, we do plenty of projects across the 55 countries. Maybe the time is not convenient to discuss all of them, but I would like to invite all our esteemed participants to check the website of AUDA-NEPAD, where they could find a detailed information on the footprint projects with all the tiny details they are looking for. And again, I'm extremely available should anyone wants to know more information about the projects, particularly trade and investment, to contact me via email to respond to any inquiries. Hope this responds to the question, Dr. Wekesa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa. And I think we have now right there an open invitation to conduct Dr. Mustafa for engagements across teaching, research, and so forth. Sometimes lots of researchers and partners and people who are just curious struggle to find an entry into the AU.
You are most welcome, Dr. Wekesa, at any time.
Yeah, I've heard many people say the AU is extremely bureaucratic and so forth. So we are happy that to have you and to have a contact. Many people on this call are researchers or people seeking partnerships and so forth. And the purpose of these events is beyond just unpacking issues, also creating networks. And so we are glad for that. I think I'll go to Dr. Dodoo. First of all, there's a curious development in Ghana that we didn't quite get to touch on. There's a new leadership there. I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about President Mahama's second entry into leadership there. But while doing so, it will also be interesting to figure out, you focused quite a bit on youth and education. Which kind of education really do we need? I've seen comments tending towards vocational education, because Africans really are going for degrees in a big way. And there are many graduates in many of our capitals who have done studies and they can't get employed. Maybe Dr. Dodoo, you could touch on those two issues, and then we'll move on to Mr. Paul Nantulya. We have about 13 minutes, so we might want to make it brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Yes, it's interesting. We find a similar trend happening in Ghana, and the same trend we are seeing it happening in the United States of America. President John Mahama was inaugurated on the 7th of January, and he's in office. And it's interesting. And we can say we are in an interesting time. He's on appointing his cabinet to work with him. Generally, the expectation is that high. People expect more. So there is that high appetite for a change. Ghanaians want to see improvement in their lives. They want to see development. Ghanaians want to see the economy growing. So there's so much high expectation on this very government, and I just honestly pray and hope that he will be able to put in place the right intervention and have the right people to work with. Because if your policies are so good, but you lack the right people to work with, it's almost like the policies may not work. So I just hope that he will get the right people to help him to really put in place that policies and interventions that will help Ghanaians, because Ghanaians are in high expectations. We want the status quo to change. And as someone has suggested, we need to talk about our success stories and, I mean, minimize bemoaning the negativity. So we need our leaders to do much more. And on the issue about youth employment, yes, it is true. We have a number of people finishing first degree. And out of this youth who have finished their first degree, bachelor's degrees. Some of them are unemployed. A large majority of them are unemployed. There were some interventions by the previous government to help youth initiatives so that the youth will come up with some entrepreneurial ventures and then to be supported. There were some business resource centers that were built in various regions to support people or youth who are interested in entrepreneurship. And that is a very laudable venture. It was a laudable intervention, but as to how much it has been able to support these individuals, I mean, we need a more evaluation into that to be able to ascertain its success. That aside, we have in two parts: youth who are skilled, who have education, yet do not have the employment, are not gainfully employed, are seeking to be employed or underemployed. These come along with its own frustrations. And then we have those who are also unskilled. And that is the problem here, because those who are unskilled easily fall prey to people who would want to influence them in the wrong way, to want to take arms or do something that is against the norm that we are talking about. So in terms of education, the vocational training education is very critical, especially for youth who are unskilled, so that everyone will be equipped to do something. And then the current president has in his manifesto that he's going to train youth who want to learn trade or vocational skills or any other venture, technical venture, for free. And we really do hope that this initiative or intervention comes off so that people will have skills to work. And I believe if you have the capacity, if your capacity is enhanced, you should be able to do or undertake any work that will support your livelihood. And so I don't know if I've been able to touch on the question so far.
Certainly, thanks, Dr. Dodoo. I think you've done a good job. And with all these, today's event is really an omnibus, an overarching kind of event. Just on the question of the new presidency of John Mahama, that could be a whole session on its own. The question on youth and skills development, that could also be, and whatever on its own. But I think you've given us perspectives to think about, and of course we'll return to some of these issues in our future events, but also in direct communication with you as the expert, Dr. Dodoo. I think now I'll turn on over to Mr. Paul Nantulya, and I think you alluded to the whole point of so very many global powers, middle and great powers, encircling the continent, or kind of coming to the continent to do business with it. This year alone, we have the BRICS Summit, we have G20, we have TICAD, which is Japanese, and there will be a few others in between. We have, and if you think about it, last year we had nearly 8 of those: Africa, Indonesia, Africa, Korea, Africa, Italy, and so forth. So the question then, Paul, is it that we have very many partners coming to us and that becomes a problem, or is it that we don't know what to do with them? And given what is going on today, over to you.
Look, thank you. I'm very glad you asked that question. And I'm glad that there are many colleagues on this forum that work with the African Union. And I'm also happy that Dr. Mustafa is here with us because NEPAD has been tasked, well, certainly on the China-Africa front, NEPAD has been tasked with monitoring some of the commitments that came out of the 9th Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. Because one of the weaknesses that has been, one of the problems that has been raised with the FOCAC mechanism is that the commitments, there's no system in place to track, to monitor these commitments, to report on them, to report on progress, what commitments have been implemented, what commitments haven't, what are the gaps, and so on. So when we head to FOCAC meetings, there's no sort of a pre-summit review of what the last 3 years, because FOCAC it's a 3-year program. There's no pre-summit review of what the previous 3 years have achieved. One can talk generally, but really there's no empirical sort of evidence in terms of those commitments. So NEPAD has been tasked with that responsibility, and I would imagine that NEPAD has this special relationship with African academics and think tanks and so on. So there's an opportunity for partnership there, and that is something that I'll be looking forward to. So I think in terms of Africa's engagement with external powers, I think it's time that because it has to be a collective effort. You know, the African Union, African private sector, academics, professionals who track these issues. You know, institutions like the Africa Center for the Study of the United States should be able to have a discussion about how these initiatives can be tracked, can be reported on, and can be monitored. So I think that is something that has been lacking. So 2025 should be a seminal year when African stakeholders working together with the African Union and NEPAD can actually begin to develop these indicators. So I think that would be the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that while it is possible to discern and to glean an African strategy, for instance, towards the United States, towards the European Union, towards China, towards Japan, while it's possible to do that, African countries still don't have a written, overarching strategy towards any of these external actors. Yet these countries regularly publish strategies towards the African continent. I really think I'm one of those working in this space who feels that this really needs to change. It needs to change. Now, there are quite a number of very creative initiatives, a lot of innovation. One of our panelists was talking about case studies of African innovation and positive things that are coming out of the African continent. I think one of those was a meeting, Bob, you were part of that, which took place some years ago, that evolved a policy framework for African engagement with China. And it got together top thinkers from the African continent and was published into a book that was meant to be a resource to the African Union, to NEPAD, and to African countries. I think those sorts of initiatives need to be supported. They need to be enhanced, because it's important for African countries to devise written strategies towards engaging these powers. Now, granted, you know, it might be a difficult thing for 54 African countries, because I mean, each of these countries have got their own bilateral relationships. But it's important, again, to remind ourselves that African countries have evolved common positions. So, for instance, there's a common African position on climate change. There's a common African position, for instance, on the use of mercenaries on the continent. There's a common African position on unconstitutional changes of government. There's a common African position on nuclear, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Okay, there's a common African position on international system reform, the Esselwini consensus, right? So African common positions on critical international issues are already there. There's already a framework for that. So I think it's important that there should be African positions on these various issues. Let me also close on a positive note, because again, we're talking about African innovation. You know, the World Health Organization has been facing problems in terms of predictable funding. This is something that got worse in 2016. And recently, there have also been some concerns about, major funders of the World Health Organization that are pulling out of a very important institution. Some African countries, I mean, as much as 60% of what they do in public health depends on World Health Organization activity. African diplomats send their best and brightest to the World Health Organization. This is something that we all know. But there's an initiative that the media did not talk about. And the African media, I would like to challenge you, specifically the African media. 14 African countries, together with the African Development Bank, teamed up with the World Health Organization to create a mechanism that generates more money for the World Health Organization in order to address these funding gaps. And that coalition of African countries have raised $45 million by August of this, by August of 2024, had raised $45 million. And this is a process that continues, right? The World Bank investment panel. Some of those, Ghana is there, Rwanda is there, South Africa is there, even countries like Congo are there, okay? And the African Development Bank is there, and there are many other African, Cape Verde, Mauritius. I think, again, this is something that needs to be encouraged, that African countries are actually trying to punch way above their weight in terms of protecting critical international institutions that make a difference on the African continent and in the global South. And I think that is something that needs to be encouraged. And I think our media need to be more alert in finding those kind of stories and actually amplifying them, because I think that's critically important. So I think I would stop there, Bob. I hope I've triggered some thinking around these issues.
No, definitely, Paul. And I just wanted also to mention that this webinar is going to be developed into a webinar report as a reminder to some of the issues we've discussed, so that they're on record for follow-up. Because, for instance, Paul has come up with quite some interesting suggestions. For instance, developing an African policy position towards global powers. I'll, in the interest of time, turn over to Professor Nuvunga. And the question here, I wanted to compress these comments that have been directed to you into one for the interest of time. Into two, actually. One is, now where do we go from here? You painted a very grim picture of where Mozambique is and where it is likely to go in the year. Should we give up on Mozambique and say, no, look, it has gone the terrible way, there's very little we can do? How do we kind of try to resolve the governance problems there? And a related question specific to our audience, most of our audience are US or Africa-based. How can the US help now that you see a United States of America that is recoiling from its normative values globally? Over to you, Professor Nuvunga, in a few sentences. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think we have to engage more to help Mozambique. If we allow Mozambique to fail, to becoming a failed state, we will see the whole Southern Africa region getting into levels of instability. Mozambique is already a narco transit corridor to South Africa and to other parts of Africa and beyond. So we need to help. I have seen, on a positive note, I have seen SADC coming here boldly to help Mozambique address violent extremism in the north. It was our failed governance here. It was our president, Nyusi, who closed the door, who did not allow SADC to meaningfully help in addressing violent extremism in the north, to the extreme that SADC, it has to exit prematurely and clearly leaving the space for the violent extremists to prosper. So it is time for SADC to operationalize its instruments and its institutions. For instance, we have been calling for SADC to send an observation and monitoring mission, which would generate a report. This report would feed into the organ for defense and security of the Africa of the SADC. But that report, it has to be a product of a mission deployed by SADC and not by our president here to send a report on what is happening. So it is the time for the organs of SADC to deploy robustly, because there is constituency. And the constituency is that being a member state of a community, you have to uphold the principles of that community. Failing to do so, you are risking the entire region to see growing of instability and others. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, United States. Well, the ambassador of the United States to Mozambique did not attend the inauguration of President Chapo, because the inauguration, that was the low-key inauguration that we have seen in our continent, only attended by President Ramaphosa. So the US did not attend that. What we were told is that they are waiting for President Trump's inauguration, and then there would be the position, the official US position on Mozambique's election. That position is not yet out. So we are waiting for that position because, as I've said, this election was chaperoned election, and the people are in the streets. So there is a need for a governance engagement in Mozambique to help Mozambique not to go the failed state direction, to recover, and to hopefully there can be a new way of working in Mozambique's politics, and perhaps getting inspiration from what the South Africans were able to do. When the ANC lost the majority, they formed a national unit government that is working for South Africans. And I think that is a model for our region, because the so-called dominant parties in the region, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Zimbabwe here, they are not genuinely dominant parties. They rely on the weapons to repress dissent. They rely on weapons to shoot, to kill young people that are in the streets calling for democratic participation. Yes, Bob.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you, Professor Nuvunga. I think you've given us perspective. I just wanted to jump in and say, of course, the Trump administration is just getting off its ground, particularly as regards the continent. And it will suggest that the nominees to the Africa Bureau, we are hearing whispers that an intellectual called J. Peter Pham, who has worked with the Atlantic Council and was US envoy to the Great Lakes region and the Sahel, might come in as a top official, whatever position that would be. Maybe there's an opportunity to reach out to the Africa team once it's constituted to look into the Mozambique issue. We have already gone over time. So let me just ask Mikatekiso to give us perspectives, particularly on a question that was raised here. How should Africa approach the new administration? And I wanted to sharpen this a little more. Mikatekiso, do you see President Trump coming over to Johannesburg for the G20 summit? And I think you know this is a loaded question. Over to you. I will have explained some more, but I just wanted to put it in that kind of succinct manner.
Well, how do we respond to such a boisterous new Trump administration? I expect all leaders of the G20 to be in Johannesburg for the G20. We do have to face some realities, however. In terms of U.S. South Africa relations, there are things to obviously discuss there. But the G20 is not a U.S. South Africa relations platform. It's a G20. It's a multilateral platform. Where a whole host of issues will be discussed that affect the global situation. So one would expect, that, I mean, by coming to South Africa, they're not coming to necessarily endorse a relationship with South Africa, for instance. They'd be coming to participate and play their role, as a global leader, if you like, at the G20. But whether or not, they will look at it that way, the Trump administration would view it, in that particular way, I do not know. Do I have much hope that he will? Of course, I must have hope that he will, because the world requires it. Not only Africa, literally the whole world actually requires it. The whole global south requires it. Europe, requires it. The whole world, actually requires the G20 to do its job. There are, of course, other considerations about whether or not, in the first place, the G20 is even representative. Whether it's an even effective platform to raise some of the issues that it actually even currently deals with, or if those issues shouldn't instead be directed to the UN, for United Nations, for instance. But I understand that even at the United Nations, President Trump has already made some remarks, particularly around funding. And so on. So, like I said earlier, I mean, we're in a difficult, period. We're in a tight spot, all round. It's very difficult, to maneuver. But I would expect him to attend. Now, as to how Africa responds to a Trump administration. I think you said it earlier, but someone mentioned it earlier. Africa, must have a strategy for others. Just like others tend to have a strategy for Africa, right? EU has a strategy for Africa. US has a strategy for Africa. Turkey has a strategy for Africa. Italy has a strategy for Africa. Everyone has a strategy for Africa, right? So it's always someone plus Africa, right? In a discussion, right? So, and Africa being 54, always Africa, 54 African states with one, somebody else who has a strategy for all of us, as a collective, Africa. But we do not have a strategy for anybody. We do not have a strategy. I'm not sure if we actually even have a strategy for Africa itself. I mean, yeah, we can talk about, the Agenda 2063, and so on. The modalities, and all of that. It is important, however, to first maybe look at, how Africa can, put together, a common voice on issues. Many issues, particularly development issues, and once it has, that common, position on such, then it becomes, a little bit more easier, if you like, to have a position on dealing with a Trump presidency, for instance. We could, if we're talking about Africa responding, Africa by way of the AU, right? Because the AU itself is not Africa. If you're talking about, the African Union responding to a Trump presidency, the African Union is facing challenges. I think all of us, know that. There are some, for instance, that have been arguing, but hang on. In recent times, African Commission chairs have been, non-former presidents, non-former heads of state, and as opposed to former heads of state. And they find it difficult to even convene those that are heads of states, right? And because they are essentially they are juniors and so on. it's a challenge that we have, in the African Union. We all of us, know all of these difficulties that the African Union is facing. So I do not know, Dr. Wekesa, whether or not at this point, we can even talk about, Africa responding to, in a particular way to a Trump presidency, other than to continue trying to build relations with everybody. What we want, is to build relations. What we want is development partners. What we want, is development finance. What we want is to build, productive capacity. What we want, is to, do all of these things. I think we need to be focused, on that, and not, for instance, reduce, the development imperative, of Africa to the need to respond to, individual heads of state. It becomes very difficult. We have enough, challenges as we speak. There is a crisis in the DRC. I'm not too sure if, the African Union, it is in a position to intervene there. You've got Turkey, offering to intervene and mediate there in Sudan, Somalia, and so on. Yeah, I love my continent, and I have every respect, for the African Union, and I wish it, to work and work very well. But we do have challenges. We have to be honest, about this. We do have challenges, and I believe, it's important for us to focus, on, our development needs, our development goals, development imperatives. Let's start looking at, those things, rather than, here's somebody who has in the past said, things that are not so nice, about African states, let alone African leaders. The reality, Trump in President Trump historically has not had very nice things to say about the continent. I wouldn't want to repeat some of the language that he has used, to describe it. But be that as it may, we've said earlier, there has to be agency. I mean, we have to do something. We can't sit there, and just fold our arms and allow for non-action, or and roll over, if you like. We have to respond, in one way or another. And I think that response ought to be, just a disciplined focus, on our development imperatives, irrespective of whoever it is that is in government, in power somewhere else.
Thank you, Mikatekiso. I think from your discussion paired with what Paul said, it looks like we might want to develop an African strategy towards external powers. We have run out of time, essentially, but the discussions have been quite edifying. This was meant to be an overarching discussion. And as I mentioned, almost every point that has been raised here, deserves a whole event on its own. But the important thing, I guess, for us is that these discussions help us as researchers to go out there and do research and produce knowledge, create partnerships, undertake advocacy and lobbying so that we can, contribute to Africa's, development and so forth. In fact, as I was speaking, or someone was speaking, a colleague here called Yul Anderson mentioned that President Trump might send Elon Musk, who is South African, to represent him during the G20. That is quite hilarious. I want to stop on that point and turn over to Adam to conclude. Thank you very much. Paul says he has a burning point.
Yes, I have a burning point. I have a burning point. Yes, when we talk about working together to create a strategy, and I really appreciate Dr. Mustafa's comment on that. That strategy should also involve African diaspora in North America, in Canada, It should also involve the African American community, African American professionals, professionals from other African, places like Jamaica, the Caribbean. It's very, very important because the African Union does have a sixth region, which is the African diaspora, which needs to be involved in these. So that's just the one burning thing I wanted to say. Thanks.
No, thank you, Paul. I think you realize, I think last week, one of the entities that was resigned by Trump was the president's, it's called PAC-ED, President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement. That is no more now, but we might find other means of engaging diaspora, including one of the richest diaspora in the world today, Elon Musk. I'm saying that with a light touch, but that's an important point that we must take on board in a more serious manner. So over to you, Adam, to close for us. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our speakers. We've had a very, very rich discussion from across the continent, which is exactly what we hope to have in these monthly programs, which is to offer platforms for thoughtful discussion from African speakers with perhaps American response, American questions. But this has been very much the kind of discussion and convening that we would like. And I like that people like to say Africa is not a country, but we've had speakers point out that all African countries actually do agree on so many things. I would also like to thank all of you for who joined us online, and I see that we're joined from across Africa, from the United States, and oh my goodness, I see we're even joined from East Asia, where it is 1 in the morning. So thank you very much for joining us in the middle of the night. This session will be available by video on our website, so watch for that. Our next Africa-US Forum will be on Monday, February the 24th at this same time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, thank you, and we are adjourned.